My name is Daisy. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in corporate project management. If you met me at work, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I'm usually the quiet one in the meeting, the person taking notes, organizing timelines, making sure everyone else's chaos somehow turns into something deliverable. People tend to describe me with words like reliable, calm, or easy to work with. And while those things are true, they're also the reasons people often underestimate me. I've learned that when someone is dependable and doesn't complain, others start assuming that person can handle anything. Extra work, tight deadlines, last-minute requests, tasks nobody else wants. Not because you're the best person for the job, but because you're the one least likely to say no. For a long time, I accepted that role without thinking too much about it. I told myself that being professional meant staying quiet, being patient, being the steady person others could rely on. And to be honest, most days I didn't mind, until the week before Christmas last year. Our company had already started slowing down for the holidays. The office was quieter than usual. People were setting up out-of-office messages, talking about travel plans, and exchanging small gifts near the coffee machine. By the afternoon of December 23rd, most of the executive team had already left for vacation, which made what happened next feel strange, because that was the moment my manager called me into his office. He told me that I would need to come in on Christmas Eve. Not remotely, not briefly. He wanted me physically in the office, finishing a project that supposedly had an immovable deadline. According to him, the client was expecting the final deliverable before the holiday. There was just one detail he seemed very confident about. The deadline couldn't be moved, at least. That's what he said. What happened next wasn't loud. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, no revenge speeches, just a series of quiet decisions. Small moments where people assumed they understood the situation when they actually didn't. And eventually, one email that changed the entire tone of the conversation. An email from the client explaining that their office was closed for the holidays, which meant the urgent deadline suddenly looked very different. This story isn't about revenge. It's about something quieter than that. It's about the moment you realize the role people expect you to play, and the moment you decide you're no longer going to play it. So before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed the exact moment someone realized they had underestimated you? If you had asked anyone in my office who I was, most of them would have answered the same way. Oh, Daisy, she handles the details. That was the label people settled on. Not a strategist, not a decision maker, not even project manager technically, just the person who handled the details. And to be fair, I did handle a lot of them. I was the one who remembered which version of the contract the client had actually signed 3 months ago. The one who knew which feature had been promised during a meeting that no one bothered to record. The one who could open a thread from 6 weeks earlier and point to the exact sentence that explained why the timeline had changed. But none of that made me visible. In fact, it did the opposite. The better you are at keeping things running smoothly, the more people assume things simply run that way on their own. My manager, Daniel Brooks, liked to call me our stabilizer. He would say it during meetings sometimes, usually with a light laugh. Don't worry about the logistics, he'd say to the executives. Daisy will stabilize it. Everyone would nod, not because they were impressed, because they were relieved. Relieved that someone else was responsible for making the mess look organized. Daniel wasn't a cruel person. That's important to understand. He wasn't the kind of manager who yelled or humiliated people. In fact, most people would have described him as reasonable, friendly, even. But he had a very specific way of thinking about people. Some people in his mind were voices in the room. Others were support structures, and I had been quietly placed in the second category. Not officially, but consistently. When a new project began, Daniel would introduce the leadership team first, the client strategist, the account director, the creative lead. Then, almost as an afterthought, he would gesture toward me, and Daisy will help coordinate everything. Help coordinate. It sounded polite, but in practice, it meant something very clear. I was the person who stayed late when the timeline slipped. The person who answered the last email at night because everyone else had already logged off. The person who fixed the tiny problems before they became visible enough for anyone else to worry about. And because I did those things without complaining, the pattern became permanent. There's a strange thing that happens in workplaces like that. People start assuming your silence means comfort. If you don't protest the first few times something inconvenient lands on your desk, the requests slowly stop sounding like requests. They become expectations. I noticed it in small moments. A meeting was scheduled at the last minute because Daisy will catch everyone up later. A document that arrived unfinished because Daisy will clean it up. A deadline that shifted quietly toward my calendar because Daisy's good at pulling things together. None of these things was dramatic. No one slammed doors. No one insulted me directly. In fact, most of the time people even thanked me. But gratitude can be a strange disguise. Sometimes it's just another way of saying, "We're glad you'll handle this." And for a long time I did. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed something simple about work. If you consistently do your job well, eventually people will notice. Eventually, someone will recognize the patterns you hold together behind the scenes. Eventually, the quiet contributions will become visible. That's what I believed, right up until the week before Christmas, because that was when I learned something important. Sometimes people don't overlook you by accident. Sometimes they simply get comfortable with the version of you that makes their lives easier. The first moment that really stayed with me didn't feel important when it happened. That's usually how these things begin. Not with a dramatic insult, just a small adjustment in how people treat you, subtle enough that everyone else moves past it without thinking. For me, it happened during a Monday planning meeting in early November. We were preparing for a large client rollout, the kind of project that involved multiple departments and more meetings than anyone actually wanted. Daniel was leading the call, as usual. The client strategist was presenting slides. The creative lead was talking about design timelines. Someone from finance kept asking about billing phases, and I was doing what I always did, listening, taking notes, tracking the parts of the conversation that didn't quite line up. About halfway through the meeting, the client strategist mentioned something that caught my attention. He casually referenced a featured delivery date that was 2 weeks earlier than the one in our internal project timeline. Most people didn't react, but I knew immediately it would cause a problem, because the engineering team had already told me privately that their schedule couldn't support that version of the deadline, so I raised my hand slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to enter the conversation. "Sorry," I said calmly. "I think the engineering timeline we confirmed last week had the feature release closer to mid-December. If we present an earlier date, we might create a mismatch with their capacity." It wasn't criticism, just clarification, the kind of thing project managers are supposed to do. For a moment, the room went quiet while people glanced at the timeline slide. Then Daniel smiled. The kind of polite smile managers use when they want to move past something quickly. "Good catch, Daisy," he said. Then he turned back to the strategist. "But let's keep the earlier date for now. It's better for the client to see momentum. We'll figure out the internal alignment later." The meeting continued. No one argued, no one seemed bothered, but I felt something small settle in the back of my mind. Not because Daniel disagreed with me. Managers do that all the time. It was the way the moment ended. Because after the meeting, as people packed up their laptops, the strategist leaned toward me and said quietly, "Hey, if the engineering schedule becomes an issue, can you just smooth it out with them?" "Smooth it out," I nodded automatically. "Sure." And that was the end of the conversation. But that phrase stayed with me longer than it probably should have. Not because it was rude, but because of what it revealed. The deadline decision had been made publicly by someone else. The responsibility for making it work had quietly shifted to me. No discussion, no acknowledgement, just an assumption. I wrote the new timeline into my Navy notebook that afternoon. Not because I was frustrated, but because documenting things had become a habit over the years. Meeting decisions, date changes, who said what, small details most people assume no one tracks. And as I wrote the note, I remember thinking something very simple. This will probably become my problem later. At the time, it still felt manageable. Just another small adjustment, another quiet correction behind the scenes. What I didn't realize yet was that moments like this weren't isolated. They were patterns. And once you start noticing patterns, you begin to see them everywhere. After that meeting in November, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no apology, no sudden realization from anyone in the room. Life at the office continued exactly the same. And that's precisely how patterns become normal. At first, the timeline issue Daniel had brushed aside became what I expected it would become. A quiet logistical problem. Engineering pushed back on the earlier feature deadline. The strategist reminded them that the client had already been shown the earlier date. Daniel asked if there was any way to compress the process. Eventually, the solution landed where these things usually did. With me. Daisy, can you coordinate the adjustments? Daniel asked during another meeting. I nodded. Of course I could. That was the role I had been playing for years. But something about the situation had shifted slightly in my mind. Not in a dramatic way. Just enough that I started noticing the language people used around me. It's strange what you hear once you start paying attention. Daisy will handle it. Just loop Daisy in. She's great at sorting these things out. On the surface, all of those statements sounded complimentary, but none of them actually meant the same thing. They didn't mean Daisy should be included in the decision. They meant that Daisy would deal with the consequences, and slowly, I began to see how often that dynamic appeared. One afternoon, the account director forwarded me a long client email chain with the note, "Can you make sense of this?" Another time, the creative team submitted design revisions that clearly didn't match the approved scope. Daniel glanced at them during a review meeting and said casually, "Daisy will adjust the documentation." Adjust the documentation, which was another way of saying the official record would quietly change to match what had already been done. None of this was aggressive. No one was trying to sabotage me. If anything, people seemed genuinely grateful. They trusted that I would make complicated situations simpler. But trust and convenience are not always the same thing. Convenience creates a very specific kind of invisibility. When everything works, people assume the system works, not the person maintaining it. And because I rarely pushed back, the boundaries around my role slowly expanded. Emails started arriving later in the evening. Quick question before tomorrow. Sorry for the late note. Just one more thing. Most of the time I answered them, not because anyone forced me to, but because I had internalized the responsibility. If a timeline slipped, I felt obligated to fix it. If a miscommunication appeared, I felt responsible for clarifying it. That's what dependable people often do. We step in before problems grow large enough to be visible. But one evening, while reviewing project documents, I opened my Navy notebook again, the one I carried everywhere. I had started using it years earlier, simply as a way to keep my thoughts organized. But over time, it had become something else. A quiet record, dates, meetings, decisions, promises people made in passing. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed how many of those entries followed the same structure. Someone else made the decision. I handled the outcome. Someone else promised a timeline. I adjusted the schedule. Someone else reassured the client. I ensured the reassurance became true. Again and again. Page after page. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided before. Not a frustrated question, just an honest one. Was I being trusted, or simply used to absorb friction? The difference between those two things can be very small, especially when everyone involved believes the arrangement is normal. And by the end of November, one thing had become clear. In the story, people around me believed about our team. I wasn't the person who made things happen. I was the person who made sure their decisions didn't fall apart. By early December, something about my workdays had started to feel clearer. Not better. Not worse. Just clearer. When you've been in the same role for years, there's a moment when the patterns around you stop feeling accidental. They start looking like a system. And once you see the system, you begin to understand your place inside it. At our company, every team had a few recognizable personalities. There were the idea people, the ones who spoke first in meetings, throwing out strategies and big picture directions. There were the relationship people, the account managers who kept clients confident and comfortable. There were the decision makers, usually senior leaders who approved timelines, budgets, and priorities. And then there were people like me, the reliability layer. We were the ones who translated ideas into documents, conversations into schedules, promises into actual deliverables. Without us, projects would stall. But our work was supposed to remain invisible. That was the quiet agreement everyone seemed to understand. I realized this most clearly during a quarterly review meeting. Daniel was presenting our team's performance summary to the department leadership group. Slides filled with metrics appeared on the screen. Client satisfaction scores, delivery success rates, project turnaround times, all strong. Daniel spoke confidently about how well our department had handled a particularly complex client rollout. That project had a lot of moving pieces, he said, gesturing toward the timeline slide, but we kept everything aligned. We. It was a small word, but I noticed something interesting. As he described the process, the names he mentioned were always the same. The strategist who defined the vision, the account director who managed the client relationship, the creative lead who oversaw the design team. And every time he described the execution phase, he used a broader phrase. The team handled the coordination. The team ensured the schedule stayed on track. The team managed the deliverables. And the team, not Daisy, not anyone specific, just a general support structure. I wasn't offended by that, not really, but it confirmed something I had already started to understand. My role wasn't designed to be visible. It was designed to be reliable. Reliable people don't need recognition. They just need to keep things working. After the meeting ended, Daniel walked past my desk and paused. "Great work keeping that rollout organized," he said casually. I thanked him, and I meant it, because Daniel did appreciate my work in his own way. He trusted me. He gave me complex projects. He relied on me to manage the difficult logistical details that other people avoided. But appreciation and authority are not the same thing. And over time, I realized something subtle about how people thought about me. When a decision was needed, they didn't look to me. When a problem appeared, they did. That difference defined my role more clearly than any job title could. I was the person who would fix things quietly, the person who would stay calm when timelines collapsed, the person who would adjust, reorganize, and stabilize whatever situation someone else had created. And because I had done that for so long without complaint, the assumption had become permanent. Daisy will handle it. Daisy will sort it out. Daisy will stay late if necessary. The expectations weren't written anywhere, but everyone understood them, including me. For years, I had accepted that position without question, not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed reliability eventually led to influence. If people saw how consistently you held things together, eventually they would trust you with more than coordination. Eventually, you would move from the background to the table where decisions were made. That's the quiet promise many hardworking people believe. But December was the month I began to understand something else. Sometimes, the role people assign you becomes so comfortable for them that they never imagine you might want something different. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen during a conflict either. In fact, if someone had been watching my day from the outside, they probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual at all. It was a Wednesday afternoon in mid-December. The office had already started to feel different. Holiday decorations had appeared near the reception desk. Someone had placed a small artificial tree in the break room, covered with mismatched ornaments from different years. People were talking more about travel plans than project deadlines. Even Daniel seemed lighter than usual. Around 3 o'clock, my calendar notification popped up for a short internal check-in with him. I walked into his office with my notebook, the same way I always did. Daniel leaned back in his chair, scrolling through something on his laptop. "Hey, Daisy," he said without looking up. "Quick thing." I sat down. He rotated his screen slightly so I could see the project dashboard. It was the same client rollout we had been managing since November. The one with the compressed feature timeline. "Everyone's heading out next week," he said casually. "Executive team's already planning to take time off." I nodded. Most companies slowed down during the holidays. That part wasn't unusual. Then he continued, "But we still need to finalize the client deliverable package before year end." I glanced at the project calendar. "Okay," I said. "What's the target date?" "Christmas Eve." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood. "Christmas Eve?" I repeated. "Yeah," Daniel said easily. "It shouldn't take long, just finishing the documentation and uploading the final materials." I looked back at the screen. Most of the leadership team had already marked themselves out of office, starting the 23rd. "So, who will be reviewing the final version?" I asked. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Honestly, it's pretty straightforward. You know the project better than anyone." There it was again. That quiet assumption, "You'll handle it." I considered the timeline. If the deliverable was due Christmas Eve, someone would need to be in the office to prepare and send it. And the way Daniel was speaking, it sounded like someone had already decided. "You'd need me to come in that day?" I asked. Daniel finally looked up. "Yeah, just for a few hours." He said it the same way someone might ask a colleague to stay 10 minutes late. No hesitation, no recognition that the date carried any particular weight. "You're the only one who really knows the full structure of the files," he added. "It'll be easier if you just wrap it up." I didn't answer immediately, not because I was angry, but because something inside me had become very still. Over the years, I had stayed late plenty of times, handled last-minute requests, adjusted schedules to make things work. But this was the first time the assumption had extended into something so personal. Christmas Eve, while the rest of the leadership team was already planning their vacations. Daniel didn't seem to notice the pause. He was already moving on to another topic. "Once it's sent, we'll start fresh in January," he said. "Clean slate, clean slate." I nodded slowly and wrote the date in my Navy notebook. December 24th, deliverable submission. For a moment, the office outside Daniel's window looked unusually quiet. People were laughing near the break room. Someone had started playing holiday music softly from their computer. The entire building already felt like it was winding down. And yet, somehow, I had just been assigned the one task that extended past the moment everyone else planned to leave. Still, my voice remained calm. "All right," I said. "I'll prepare everything." Daniel smiled, clearly satisfied. "Perfect. I knew I could count on you." And as I walked back to my desk, I realized something important. For Daniel, this decision wasn't unusual. It wasn't inconsiderate. It wasn't even something he thought required discussion. Because in the story, he believed in our team. This was exactly the kind of thing Daisy handled. When people hear a story like this, they usually imagine a confrontation. They expect the moment when someone pushes their chair back, crosses their arms, and says something like, "Actually, that's not acceptable." But that's not what happened. I didn't argue with Daniel. I didn't protest the Christmas Eve assignment. And I didn't tell anyone in the office that the decision bothered me. From the outside, nothing changed at all. The next morning, I arrived at work at the same time I always did. I opened my laptop, reviewed the project files, and began organizing the deliverable package the way I normally would. Emails went out, timelines were updated, documentation folders were cleaned and renamed. If anyone had watched my day, they would have seen the same quiet routine they were used to seeing. But internally, something had shifted. Because for the first time in a long while, my silence wasn't automatic. It was deliberate. There's a difference between staying quiet because you don't want to cause trouble and staying quiet because you're observing something. In that week, I started observing more carefully than usual. The office atmosphere had become noticeably lighter. People were bringing small gift bags to each other's desks. Someone had organized a casual holiday lunch in the conference room. One by one, out-of-office messages began appearing in email signatures. Out of office starting December 23rd. Limited availability through the holidays. back January 2nd. Daniel even sent a quick message to the team confirming that he would be traveling to visit family starting the afternoon of the 23rd. When I read that email, I simply added another note to my Navy notebook. Daniel, oh. December 23rd afternoon, no judgment, just a record. Later that same day, the account director stopped by my desk. "Hey, Daisy," she said cheerfully. "Are you traveling for the holidays?" "Not this year," I replied. "Nice, yeah," she said. "Honestly, I'm counting down the hours. This year has been exhausting." She laughed and waved her phone. 3 more days. I smiled politely. 3 days. For most people in the office, the work year was already ending. But for me, the calendar looked slightly different. December 24th was still sitting quietly on my project timeline, and the more I reviewed the deliverable package we were preparing, the more something about it began to feel unusual. Not wrong, just worth checking. Because the urgency Daniel had described didn't fully match the communication history with the client. The last email from them about the project timeline had been brief. Looking forward to reviewing the final materials before year-end. Before year-end. Not Christmas Eve, not a specific date at all. Still, I continued preparing the deliverable the way I normally would. File structure, version control, documentation notes. But while I worked, I also did something else. I reread the entire client email thread from the beginning, not quickly, carefully. The way you reread a conversation when you want to understand not just what was said, but what was assumed. And as I followed the chain of messages week by week, something interesting appeared, a pattern I hadn't paid attention to before, because every time the timeline had shifted, the wording had changed slightly. The client never insisted on a specific date. That detail had entered the conversation somewhere else. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the screen for a long moment. Then I opened my notebook again and wrote a short question on the next empty page. Who actually set the Christmas Eve deadline? It was a simple question. But sometimes, simple questions reveal things people haven't thought about very carefully. And at that point, I wasn't upset. I wasn't planning a response. I was just curious. Because once silence becomes a choice, you start paying attention to details that other people overlook. There's something people rarely notice about quiet employees. When you're the person who doesn't interrupt meetings, who doesn't compete for speaking time, who doesn't react emotionally to pressure, people assume you're simply passive. They assume silence means disengagement. But sometimes silence means observation, and observation creates a very different kind of awareness. By the 3rd week of December, most of the office had mentally checked out for the holidays. The break room smelled like cinnamon candles and reheated leftovers from the holiday lunch. Someone had started wearing Christmas sweaters to work. Even the email traffic had slowed down, but my desk was still covered in project folders. The client deliverable Daniel wanted sent on Christmas Eve had grown into a fairly large package. Documentation files, release summaries, version notes, and the project timeline that explained how everything had come together. Preparing it properly required revisiting months of communication. And as I worked through those records, I began to see the project from a perspective most people never bothered to examine. Because when you manage the documentation, you see everything. Not just the decisions people remember, but the small transitions between them, the phrases used in emails, the subtle adjustments to timelines, the moments where someone says something casually, and that sentence quietly becomes policy. I opened the earliest message from the client about the final delivery. It was from late October. The client had written, "We'd love to review the completed materials before the end of the year if possible. If possible, not urgent, not mandatory, just a preference." The next message in the thread came from Daniel. He replied confidently, "We'll ensure everything is finalized before the holiday break." Holiday break, still flexible. Then, a week later, during an internal meeting, the phrase changed again. Someone asked about the delivery window. Daniel said, "Let's aim for Christmas Eve so the client has it before year-end." Aim, still not a requirement, but by the time that sentence appeared in the official project timeline, the language had shifted one more time. Final deliverable due December 24th. No context, no explanation, just a date. And once a date appears in a project document, it tends to acquire a kind of authority. People stop asking where it came from. They simply start working toward it. I stared at the timeline for a long moment. Then I flipped open my notebook again. The pages from November and early December suddenly made more sense. Engineering is pushing back. Design revisions are arriving late. Daniel insisted the schedule couldn't move. Everyone is treating December 24th as if it were carved into the contract. But I had the contract. I opened the file and searched for the final delivery clause. There it was. Final documentation to be provided prior to the close of the calendar year. Prior to the close of the calendar year. December 31st. Not December 24th. Not even close. Which meant something very simple. The urgency Daniel had described wasn't coming from the client. It was coming from our side. Most likely because someone wanted the project marked as completed before the holiday reporting period. It was a managerial convenience, not a contractual obligation. I didn't feel angry when I realized this. Mostly I felt clarity, because the situation suddenly looked very different from the one Daniel had presented. He had insisted the deadline couldn't be moved, but in reality, the deadline had never been fixed in the first place. For a few minutes, I just sat quietly in my chair. Around me, the office hummed with its usual late afternoon sounds. Keyboards clicking, someone laughing down the hallway, a printer running somewhere near the conference rooms. No one had any idea what I was reviewing, and no one was watching closely enough to notice the difference between a person doing their job and a person understanding the full structure of a situation. Because the truth is, documentation creates leverage, not dramatic leverage. Not the kind used to threaten people, but the kind that creates clarity. And clarity changes how decisions are made. I wrote one more line in my notebook. Client deadline, before year-end, December 31st. Internal timeline, December 24th, Daniel. Then I closed the notebook and returned to organizing the deliverable files. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. Daisy was preparing the project package. Daisy was making sure the documentation was perfect. Daisy was quietly handling the details. But what no one noticed was that I now understood the timeline better than anyone else in the building. And sometimes, that's the moment when the balance of a situation begins to shift. Not because anyone announces it, but because one person finally sees the structure clearly. The interesting thing about discovering leverage is that it rarely feels dramatic. There's no sudden rush of power, no triumphant music playing somewhere in the background. Most of the time it feels quiet, almost ordinary. After realizing that the Christmas Eve deadline wasn't actually required by the client, I didn't rush to confront anyone. I didn't send an email asking for clarification. Instead, I did what I had always done. I kept working. But this time I worked with a slightly different awareness. Over the next 2 days, I finished organizing the deliverable package exactly as planned. Every file was labeled correctly. Every document had version notes. Every meeting decision had been summarized and linked to the appropriate section. If the project needed to be sent at any moment, it would be ready. That part of the job still mattered to me, because professionalism, at least in my view, doesn't disappear just because you notice something unfair. But while I was preparing the files, I also did something else. I double-checked the communication trail one more time, not just the emails, everything, the contract, the project charter, the internal timeline revisions, and eventually, I reached the final piece of confirmation. A short email from the client's operations manager, sent 2 weeks earlier. It had arrived late in the evening, buried between several other messages. The subject line simply read, "Holiday schedule update." The message itself was brief. Our office will be closed December 23rd to 26th for the holidays. We'll review project updates when the team returns the following week. I read the message twice, then a third time. Closed, December 23rd to 26th, which meant something very straightforward. If I had come into the office on Christmas Eve and sent the deliverable exactly the way Daniel requested, No one on the client side would even see it until after Christmas. The urgent deadline would essentially disappear into an empty inbox. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Outside the window, the winter light had already started fading. The office was quieter than usual. A few desks near mine were already empty, people beginning their vacations early. And for a moment, I just sat there thinking about how easily this entire situation had formed. Daniel hadn't checked the client's holiday schedule. The strategist probably assumed someone else had. The account director trusted the timeline Daniel announced, and because the date had entered the project document, everyone treated it like a fact, including me, at least until now. I opened my notebook again and wrote down the client's message word for word. Office closed December 23rd to 26th. Review updates following week. Then I closed the notebook and placed it beside my laptop. The room around me was calm, no tension, no urgency, just the quiet hum of a building preparing to shut down for the year. And that was when something else became clear. I didn't actually need to argue with anyone. I didn't need to point out the inconsistency. I didn't need to accuse Daniel of anything, because the situation contained its own answer. All it required was the right moment for that answer to become visible. There's a certain kind of confidence that comes from understanding the structure of a problem better than the people managing it. Not arrogance, just clarity, and clarity allows you to move carefully. I finished organizing the deliverable package before leaving that evening. Everything was ready, exactly the way Daniel had requested. But before shutting down my computer, I drafted one final email. Not to Daniel, to the client. A short message confirming the delivery timeline and asking a simple question about their holiday availability. I didn't send it yet. I saved it in my drafts folder. Then I packed up my notebook, turned off the lights above my desk, and walked toward the elevator. Because sometimes the most powerful step in a situation is simply waiting for the moment when the truth reveals itself naturally. No confrontation required. By the time the final week before Christmas arrived, the office had begun to empty in a way that felt almost ceremonial. Desks that had been busy all year were suddenly quiet, chairs pushed in, computer monitors dark. Out-of-office messages multiplied in my inbox like a slow wave moving through the building. The creative team left first, then finance. By Wednesday afternoon, several executives had already said their holiday goodbyes. Daniel stopped by my desk briefly that morning. "Everything on track for the 24th?" he asked. "Yes," I said calmly. "The package is ready." "Perfect," he replied. "I'll be out starting tomorrow afternoon, but you've got everything under control." I nodded. He smiled, already halfway turned toward the hallway. "I knew I could count on you." That phrase again. It had followed me through most of my career. Reliable, dependable, someone who would make sure the final details happened even when everyone else had moved on. And for a moment, I considered the simplest path. I could show up on Christmas Eve, send the files, close the project. No one would question it. The situation would disappear quietly, the way most of my work usually did. But that evening, after the office had grown quiet again, I opened the email draft I had saved 2 days earlier, the one addressed to the client. It was a very ordinary message. No accusations, no complications, just a brief confirmation of the delivery timing. I reread the message slowly. Then I looked again at the client's earlier note about their holiday closure, December 23rd to 26th, which meant something very simple. If the deliverable was sent on December 24th, no one on their side would read it. The email would arrive in an empty office, sit in an unattended inbox, and then be reviewed the following week. Exactly the same way it would be reviewed if it were sent later. The difference between those two options was small, but not meaningless. One required someone to come into the office on Christmas Eve, the other didn't. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the nearly empty workspace. The overhead lights had already dimmed automatically for the evening. Through the windows, the city outside was beginning to glow with holiday lights. For the first time since Daniel had assigned the task, I allowed myself to think about the situation from a different perspective. Not as the person responsible for fixing it, but as the person who simply understood it clearly. Daniel believed the deadline couldn't be moved, but the client had never asked for that date. Daniel believed the deliverable had to be sent on Christmas Eve, but the client's office would be closed, and because everyone trusted the timeline Daniel had announced, no one had stopped to check the details, except me. I turned back to my laptop. The email draft was still open. My message was polite and straightforward. Hi. I'm preparing the final documentation package for the project and wanted to confirm the best time for delivery, given the holiday schedule. Would you prefer the materials before your office closes or when the team returns next week? That was it. A simple clarification, no assumptions, no accusations, just a question. But questions have a way of changing conversations, especially when they reveal information people overlooked. I hovered my cursor over the send button for a moment. Then I clicked it. The email disappeared into the thread. Quiet, ordinary, almost invisible. But sometimes the most irreversible decisions look exactly like that. Not dramatic, not confrontational. Just a single step that allows the truth of a situation to appear on its own. I shut down my laptop, closed my notebook, and left the office for the evening. Because at that point, the next move didn't belong to me anymore. The reply from the client didn't arrive immediately, and that was perfectly normal. It was the afternoon of December 21st, and most companies were already shifting into holiday mode. Email response times were slower. Conversations paused mid-thread. People logged off earlier than usual. Still, I kept working. Not because anything urgent remained to be done. The deliverable package had already been finalized. But because routine has a way of keeping situations calm. If anyone glanced at my screen, they would see exactly what they expected to see. Daisy is reviewing documents. Daisy is organizing folders. Daisy was making sure everything was ready for the Christmas Eve submission. Daniel had already left the office by early afternoon on the 22nd. Before leaving, he stopped by my desk again. Everything good? He asked. Yes, I said. Great, he replied. Just send it on the 24th as we discussed. His tone was relaxed, the tone of someone already mentally on vacation. Then he added something almost casually. Appreciate you handling this while everyone's out. I nodded politely. No problem. And just like that, he left. His office lights turned off 15 minutes later. By the end of the afternoon, the floor was nearly empty. A few desks remained occupied by people finishing last-minute tasks before their own departures, but the energy of the building had clearly shifted. The work year was over for most of them. For me, the situation was simply waiting. I checked my inbox once more before leaving that evening. No response yet from the client. That wasn't surprising. Their office closure was scheduled to begin the next morning, which meant my message had likely arrived right as their team was shutting down for the holiday. So I closed my laptop, packed my notebook into my bag, and headed for the elevator. As the door slid closed, I realized something interesting. For the first time since Daniel had assigned the Christmas Eve task, I felt completely relaxed. Not because the situation had resolved yet, but because the responsibility had shifted. I had asked the right question. Now the timeline belonged to the answer. The next morning, December 23rd, I logged in from home briefly to check messages. The office building itself was technically open, but most departments had already switched to minimal staffing. My inbox contained exactly one new reply from the client. The message was short, friendly, and completely straightforward. Thanks for checking. Since our office is closed through the holiday, feel free to send the materials when everyone returns next week. No rush at all. No rush at all. I read the sentence twice. Then I leaned back in my chair. There it was. The clarity that had been sitting quietly inside the situation from the beginning. The client didn't expect a Christmas Eve delivery. They didn't even want one. They simply wanted the files whenever their team returned, which meant something very simple. No one needed to be in the office on December 24th. Not me. Not anyone. I saved the email, added it to the project documentation folder, and then wrote one final note in my Navy notebook. Client confirmed, deliverable acceptable after holiday closure. That was it. No dramatic reaction, no celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement of the reality that had always been there. By noon, the city outside had already slowed to its holiday rhythm. Streets quieter, offices dark, and for the first time all week, I closed my laptop without reopening the project files. Because the next step in the situation didn't require action, it required patience. The deliverable was ready. The client had confirmed the timeline, and the one person who believed the deadline couldn't move was currently on vacation. For the next few days, nothing happened, which, in a way, was exactly the point. December 24th came and went quietly. I didn't go into the office. No one asked me to. No emergency messages appeared in my inbox. No urgent calls arrived from Daniel or anyone else on the leadership team. The project files remained exactly where they were, organized, complete, and ready, but untouched, because the client's office was closed, just like they had said. Christmas passed, and the following Monday, the city slowly returned to life. People began logging back into email after the holiday break. That morning, I opened my laptop and checked the project thread. The client team had returned. Their first message was simple. Hope everyone had a great holiday. Looking forward to reviewing the final materials when you have a chance to send them. No mention of a missed deadline, no confusion, no urgency. Just a normal continuation of the conversation. I attached the deliverable package and sent it. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. Within an hour, the client replied, "Received, thank you. We'll begin reviewing this week." Smooth, professional, exactly the kind of exchange that usually happens when timelines are handled correctly. But the interesting part of the story didn't begin with the client. It began the next day, when the leadership team returned from vacation and started reviewing the project dashboard. Because, according to the internal timeline Daniel had created, the final deliverable had supposedly been due December 24th, and when people returned to the office and opened the project tracker, that date was sitting there quietly in the record, waiting to be noticed. Daniel returned to the office on January 2nd. The building felt different again. People greeting each other in the hallway, coffee machines working overtime, everyone slowly easing back into the rhythm of the new year. I was already at my desk when he arrived. About an hour later, a message popped up on my screen. "Daniel. Hey Daisy. Quick question about the rollout project." I walked into his office a few minutes later. He had the project dashboard open on his monitor. His expression wasn't angry, just slightly puzzled. "I noticed the deliverable shows as sent after the 24th, he said. "I thought we had that scheduled for Christmas Eve." His tone suggested he was trying to reconstruct something he vaguely remembered. "Do not accuse anyone. Just understand." "Yes," I said calmly. I confirmed the timeline with the client before sending it. Daniel looked up from the screen. "They were closed for the holiday," I continued. "Their operations manager asked that we send the materials when their team returned." For a moment, he didn't respond. He scrolled through the email thread I had attached to the project folder. The message from the client was right there, clear, simple, no rush at all. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "Oh," he said quietly. That was it. No frustration, no criticism, just the subtle realization that the urgency he had insisted on had never actually existed. "I must have missed that update," he added after a moment. "It came through the week before the break," I said. Another short pause. Then Daniel nodded slowly and closed the dashboard window. "Well," he said, exhaling lightly, "looks like it worked out fine." And he was right. The client was satisfied. The deliverable was complete. The project had closed successfully. Nothing dramatic had happened, but something had shifted, because for the first time in a long while, Daniel had just seen the situation from the other side, not as the person assigning the work, but as the person who had misunderstood the timeline. and by the time that realization arrived, there was nothing left to correct. A few days after that conversation, Daniel stopped by my desk again. Not urgently, just the way managers sometimes pause when they want to revisit something quietly. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. I followed him into his office. He closed the door, though not completely, just enough to make the space feel a little more private. Daniel leaned against the edge of his desk. "I was thinking about the Christmas timeline," he said. His tone wasn't defensive. If anything, it sounded reflective. I realized I probably should have double-checked the client's schedule before setting that date. I nodded slightly. "It happens," I said. He glanced toward the window for a moment before continuing. "I also realized something else," he added. "I asked you to come in on Christmas Eve without really asking if that worked for you." The room stayed quiet for a second, not uncomfortable, just honest. "I assumed you'd handle it," he said. There it was again, the same assumption that had shaped so many small decisions before. But this time he heard it himself. I didn't respond immediately. Then I said something simple. "I usually do." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I know," he said. There was no argument after that, no apology speech, no dramatic resolution, just a quiet acknowledgement of how the situation had unfolded. And sometimes, that kind of clarity is enough, because confrontation doesn't always need volume. Sometimes it only needs a moment where both people finally see the same picture. After that conversation, nothing about my job changed overnight. My desk stayed in the same place. My responsibilities were still centered around projects and timelines. Meetings continued the way they always had. But something subtle shifted, not in the office structure, in the way people spoke to me. Daniel especially became more careful about assumptions. When new timelines were discussed, he started asking questions he hadn't asked before. "Does this date actually come from the client? Can we confirm that first?" They were small moments, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But I noticed, and something inside me had changed too. For years, I had believed the way to earn influence was simply to keep proving your reliability, to quietly absorb problems and keep things moving. But that experience taught me something different. Reliability matters. But clarity matters more. Because when you understand the full structure of a situation, the contract, the communication, the assumptions people are making, you're no longer just the person who fixes things. You become the person who sees things earlier. And once you see clearly, you don't need to argue very often. Most of the time, the truth speaks for itself. I still carry the same Navy notebook with me every day. I still write down timelines, decisions, and small details people forget 5 minutes later. But I no longer think of those notes as reminders. They're perspective, a quiet way of understanding how situations actually form. And these days, when someone says Daisy will handle it, the meaning feels a little different, not invisible, just trusted. When I think back on that week before Christmas, nothing about it looks dramatic. No arguments, no ultimatums. No one is raising their voice in a conference room. From the outside, it probably looked like a very ordinary project closing. But the lesson stayed with me. For a long time, I believed the best way to succeed at work was simple. Be dependable, work hard, and solve problems quietly. And those things do matter. But what I understand now is that quiet competence isn't just about fixing situations. It's about seeing them clearly. That Christmas Eve situation never needed a confrontation. The facts were already there. In the contract, in the emails, in the client's own message. All it required was someone patient enough to read the details carefully. Sometimes the strongest position you can have at work isn't authority, it's clarity. Because when you understand the reality of a situation better than everyone else in the room, you don't need to fight for control. You simply ask the right question and let the answer speak. I still work in project management today, and situations like that still happen. Deadlines appear suddenly, assumptions spread through teams, people move fast and forget to check the small details. But now, When those moments happen, I approach them differently. Not with frustration, just with calm attention. Because the quiet truth is this: the person who understands the full story is rarely the one who needs to raise their voice. And I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment at work where you realized someone had completely misunderstood a situation and you were the only one who noticed it?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.